So please welcome that talk.
Thanks, Tom. Thank you all for, can everybody hear me okay back in there? Great. Wow, what an awesome turnout. Thank you so much for taking the time to come out tonight. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to chat with you all. Just real quickly, just want to be sure that folks are aware of what cooperative extension actually is. Cooperative extension, we're basically the public outreach arm of the university. It's our role to take the research that happens at UNH and at other institutions and bring it out to the public. And likewise, it's our role to work with landowners and communities to learn about the variety of different things that you are working on and problems that you might be dealing with, from your forest to agriculture to family and food safety, and to bring your needs back to the university so we can be sure that we're conducting research that actually makes a difference. And so Steve and I work in the natural resources or the forestry and wildlife program at Cooperative Extension, and we have about 9 to 10 other colleagues in that program who work throughout the state, and we're available to meet with landowners and communities free of charge to come visit your property, help you identify what you have for trees and habitats, wetlands, and help you work with those resources and put you in contact with professionals who can help you manage your land and steward your land in a way that accomplishes your objectives without reducing the quality of those resources. So you'll see it again later, but I always say your call gets us out of the office. So please grab a card and you'll see our number and emails on this, so please don't hesitate to use that. It's great. I had the opportunity to spend the afternoon over in Ringe today on this side of the state working with some landowners, and it's a pleasure to continue working with folks today. So again, Steve's provided a real great overview of kind of the history of things that influence the forest here in New Hampshire. And we talk about the devastation that happens from a hurricane, and it can look like a devastation, but as a wildlife biologist, I love it. It's awesome. That shrubby, nasty, tangled stuff that you don't want to work in. It's like some of the best habitat ever. So a lot of my talk is going to be focused on the value of that kind of disturbed forest, because it really has become an uncommon thing for a variety of reasons. We just don't have a lot of that young forest on our landscape anymore. As Steve said, most of our forest is kind of middle-aged. It ranges between like 80 to 120 years old. So we're lacking that old growth, and we're lacking a lot of that young stuff. And so that has important consequences on the wildlife that we have here in New Hampshire. But again, I'm going to focus primarily on young forest or shrubland habitat. These are basically areas that are dominated by probably some lights. It's getting dark out there, and if I hear snoring, we're going to turn the lights back on. So shrublands are young forests. These are areas that are dominated by young trees and shrubs. They often have a variety of grasses and ferns and wildflowers mixed in. And the key is that there's few or no trees to cast shade to inhibit shrubs from growing in these areas. They're called thickets, early successional habitats, young forest. Shrublands, I'm probably going to call them young forests and shrublands throughout this presentation. So why do we care about them from a wildlife standpoint? Well, we care because the vast majority of our wildlife species here in New Hampshire use shrublands for at least some of their needs. Birds, mammals, reptiles, amphibians, and countless insects. But we also have a large number of wildlife species that require shrublands as their primary habitat. So if those young forests or shrublands are removed from the landscape, so too are these wildlife species. So here in New Hampshire, we have about 36 species of birds that require shrubby habitat as their primary nesting habitat. We call these the shrubland dependent or shrubland birds. So that includes our prairie warblers and buntings and blue-winged warblers and the towhee that Steve referred to earlier. Wide variety of species. Most of these birds are what we call habitat specialists. Again, if it's not shrubby, they don't occur there. But these birds are pretty particular. They actually require shrublands that are larger than a certain minimum size, and I'll talk about that size in a bit. And they also require specific vegetation structure. Some birds in particular like kind of wet shrubby areas, other birds like dry shrubby areas, some like it tall, some like it short. And the reason that shrublands are important to these birds is that they provide very important habitat components and meet their needs, providing them with great nesting cover where they can avoid predators, provides them with an abundance of insects, particularly with caterpillars, which are an incredibly important food source that birds use to raise their young. Certain birds like to have tall saplings in the middle of their shrublands that they can get to the very tippity tops and sing from, like this chestnut-sided warbler. And many of these birds, again, this is one of those towhees, come into these areas because there's often abundance of fruit like blueberries and raspberries. So in addition to the birds, there's a wide variety of reptiles and amphibians and mammals and insects that also require these as habitat. And then as you make your way out tonight, there's a table just before you leave the front door. And on that table is a variety of our habitat stewardship brochures that we've developed that kind of provide a real nice color photos, real handy little guide to some of the critical habitats that we have here in New Hampshire, and they list the wildlife species that are associated with them. So I encourage you to check those out as we go. And so here we just have our shrublands brochure, and these are some of the species that are listed in that brochure that require shrublands for at least portion of their life. Our wood turtles, and everybody loves the snakes like black racers and smooth green snakes, hognose snakes, incredibly rare species on the landscape. Again, New England cottontails. This is our native species of cottontail that is currently listed as endangered here in New Hampshire. And then a variety of different insects, and some of the kind of the poster children insects that we have are the Carner blue butterfly and the frosted elfin, which occur in our remnant pine barrens in Concord. So I talked about why shrublands are important for the birds, but for the reptiles and amphibians, many of the shrublands particularly provide really important nesting sites for many of our turtles. And where a shrubland is located on the landscape in relation to different wetlands determines how it can be used by certain turtles. So for example, if a shrubby area that has some dry exposed soil in it is in close proximity, say within a half a mile or so of a river, there's a very good chance that it might be used by wood turtles, which require rivers as their primary wetland habitats, and they'll come to these areas to nest. If that shrubland is near like a cattail marsh, we might expect Blanding's turtles or spotted turtles. And then other species like painted turtles and snapping turtles, they kind of occur in almost all wetlands, and so any shrubland that's near a wetland is very likely to be used as nesting habitat for one or more turtle species. Excuse me. These habitats are also very important for a variety of insects, and the things that they provide the insects include host plants for young insects, particularly for caterpillars. What species is that? Monarch. What is it on? Milkweed. Yep. So again, most of our insects are specialized to forage on a very limited number of plants. And so often these shrubby areas contain a variety and a diversity of different plant species. And so as a result, they often support a huge abundance and variety of insects. And they're not only, those plants not only provide larval food, but they also are an important source of nectar and pollen for many different species. Any of these shrubby areas that have exposed soils can be used as nesting sites for a variety of these insects as well. These are nest galleries of solitary bees, which are one of our native bee species. Other unique habitats that can be in here are something as simple as a puddled area in exposed soil can be utilized by male butterflies. They come and they drink that water to get the minerals in the water, and that actually enhances their sperm production and increases their ability to reproduce successfully. Okay, so currently on the New Hampshire landscape, I usually think that we have two primary types of shrublands. We have wet shrublands and we have dry shrublands. And there's a wide variety of species that will use both types, so there's a fair amount of overlap with regards to what wildlife will use these, but they also support different species that don't occur in one or the other. So our wet shrublands today currently occur in some pretty predictable areas. They occur like in those shrubby beaver meadows. So when a dam breaks and the water drains out and all the water comes out, those areas grow back into that young shrubby forest scenario. Thickets along pond or stream edges are another place that we see this. And then red maple swamps often will have a dense shrub layer in them. And these are really critical habitats for a variety of species. Right now, how many folks have heard woodcock moving through the area? Peep, peep. So again, that's where they are nesting and foraging in the moist soil that are in there. There's a wide variety of uncommon birds, including rusty blackbirds and golden winged warblers, but also common species like yellow warblers and gray catbirds. And this is very historic habitat where we would have expected New England cottontails to occur. And they currently will use these shrubby stream borders as a way to move across our landscape today. So as a general rule, our wet shrublands are still pretty common. As Steve said, we don't let beavers really flood to the extent that they once did, but overall, our wet shrublands are pretty common throughout New Hampshire. What are less common are the dry shrublands. And these occurred in a few important spots historically before Europeans came and started clearing the land. The largest dry shrublands occurred as pine oak barrens. So you think about the Ossipee pine, pitch pine barrens, the city of Concord Heights, and the Concord Airport are on remnant pine barrens. We have larger ones down in Amherst, Mass, out in Albany, down in New Jersey. Other areas that were shrubby were ridge tops. So ridge tops which are dry, subject to regular lightning strikes, which would cause periodic fires and keep them in a shrubby condition. And then out on the coast in coastal dunes. So together, these habitats should be expected to have supported really the full suite of wildlife species that require shrublands in New Hampshire, from all of our birds, reptiles, cottontails, and many of our rare insects. We would expect that. So this, hopefully you can see these little dots here. These are the locations of some of the largest historic pine barrens that occur in New England. And these areas very likely functioned as kind of stable source, what we call source habitats, where birds in particular were able to breed and produce a ton of offspring, which would then distribute themselves across the larger landscape. And as we learn more about how birds travel and disperse, we're learning that when a young bird leaves, when it fledges and leaves the nest and it goes off to make its own way in the world, it often gets away from where its parents were, where it was born. And we're learning that these birds are often moving sometimes 100 miles or more to where they're going to have their next habitat. And so when we put these pine barrens on the landscape, almost all of them are within the known dispersal distances of many of these shrubland birds. And so we should expect that these kind of remnant pine barrens were really critical habitats for kind of maintaining a stable population of these species in the landscape. And then as a 38 hurricane comes or a windstorm comes and blows down a section of a forest, those birds are then able to kind of expand their populations. And so we would expect that after the 38 hurricane, populations of these shrubland birds were just probably at an all-time high. And then as that forest grew back up and was no longer shrubby, the bird populations kind of retreated back to those big pine barren habitats. However, unfortunately, the vast majority of these historic dry habitats have been significantly reduced in size, primarily as a result of development. Again, Concord pine barrens is just a little remnant fraction of them, of what was there historically. Dry, no trees, perfect for putting buildings and development on. Also, we don't let fires burn anymore. And there's a lot of good reason for that because we have houses and infrastructure, but fire was very important for maintaining pine barrens and ridge tops in that shrubby condition. So we had these areas where they were predictably shrubby. However, you know, as we go out into our forest today, most of us wouldn't describe our forest as shrubby. But boy, an old growth forest was quite shrubby. You know, we typically kind of think of old growth as just big, monstrous trees. And there definitely were big, monster trees in there. But when a big oak fell down, the top of that oak was bigger around than this room. And so when it came down, it created a big opening in the forest, which then let a ton of sunlight in, and that sunlight would grow shrubs. And so that old growth forest was incredibly diverse, big trees, middle-sized trees, shrubby cover. And so that old growth forest was very diverse, very structurally diverse, and probably itself supported many shrubland species that we don't see in our forest today because it lacks that shrubby cover. Most importantly, for some of our species, like we'll see New England cottontails, they require shrubby cover to move across the landscape because they're on everybody's menu. Everybody likes to eat cottontails. And so if a cottontail bebops its way across an opening that doesn't have shrubby cover, it is no longer a cottontail, it's somebody's food. And so our historic forest allowed these species to kind of move freely across the landscape because there was lots of cover. Another important thing to think about that I won't talk a lot about, but it is really important when it comes to how we manage shrublands on the landscape today. A lot of what we do is try to minimize the chances that critters are getting predated. And our landscape today looks very different with regards to what predators are on it. Many of our wildlife species evolved in not only a very different landscape, but they evolved without many of the predators that we have today. Red foxes, for example, were introduced. This is one of the major predators on our landscape today. And it's kind of funny to think about that, but it actually is, it's absolutely true. You know, any place that has houses has house cats outside and significant predators, particularly of birds. Eastern coyotes, this is a species that was not in New Hampshire until 1940. The first coyotes were, migrated, expanded their range from the west. One group of them kind of came through Canada and interbred with wolves. Another group came from southern states and they kind of merged up into New England, into kind of this unique species that we have here today, but very, very unique predator. Also, some of other predators like raccoons and ravens and crows were obviously here historically, but because we have compost, because we have trash, because we feed our animals outside, our activities help to support and raise those predator populations, which means that if you are a bird or a small mammal or a cottontail living near somebody's house, you're exposed to a ton of predators that you normally hadn't evolved with. Okay, so today, although the pine barrens and the ridge tops are a little less common, we do have some kind of predictable dry shrublands that are actually human created. And we find that the most common human created dry shrublands that we have on our landscape are shrubby old fields, so fields that are no longer mowed, active and abandoned gravel pits, again areas that are often looked at as waste places, shrubby transmission line rights of way, especially those that are greater than about 50 yards long, and regenerating clear cuts. And these are really critical habitats for many of the wildlife species that require dry shrublands in our landscape today. Again, our landscape is dangerous. if you are a prey animal. So again, for cottontails, what we find is that cottontails, where New England cottontails occur are in just these little remnant fragments of shrubby areas, often old fields or regenerating clear cuts. And what we find, we actually put radio transmitters on these rabbits to figure out how they move, and we're actually reintroducing New England cottontails in a variety of areas in New Hampshire because their populations are doing so poor. And those radio transmitters allow us to see how rabbits move across the landscape. And what we find is that the vast majority of the rabbits never move out of the shrubland that we put them in, because if they do, they get eaten. You know, so right now our shrublands with regards to cottontails are kind of like these donuts or islands. So inside that donut you're safe because it's shrubby and you can get away, but if you step outside of it, you've got this big wide open understory with lots of predators looking for you, and so it's a really inhospitable spot to be. And so what we find is that when we're managing habitat for species like New England cottontails, we're usually trying to make big islands. So we try to make big openings, big shrubby areas that allow populations to exist without necessarily having to move. So bigger is better. And again, when I talking about big, when we're making openings for New England cottontails, like a new opening, we're making clear cuts 10, 20, 25 acres in size to try to get big shrubby openings. Now the birds are a little less what we call area sensitive, but they also require, many of them require large openings, 5 to 10 acres in size. So although those cottontails have a hard time moving across the landscape, good thing about birds is what? They have wings, so they can move. And so what we find is that most of our shrubland birds are actually quite mobile, and in fact, it's important to recognize that most of them are migrants. So our shrubland birds are starting to arrive. Towhees arrived today. I heard towhees for the first time this year. Those towhees came from southern states. Prairie warblers are going to be coming from Panama or in other tropical areas, so they've just flown 2,000 miles, so flying across this town of Keene isn't that big of a deal for these guys. And so we've actually done some pretty unique stuff here in New Hampshire, especially in southeastern New Hampshire, where we have put colored leg bands on a variety of birds. Prairie warblers, eastern towhees, and field sparrows, about 306 birds. And captured them with fine mist nets, put color bands on them. That allows us to then, we let those birds go, and it allows us to identify individual birds by the color combinations on their legs just with binoculars. And I hire a huge number of undergraduate students to kind of go, find these birds. All right, we captured them, we let them go everywhere where you think one of these birds can be and see if any of our birds are there. And what we find is that many individual birds use more than one shrubby area in a nesting season. And the average distance that those birds are moving between shrublands is about 4 miles, which is, that's surprising to bird biologists. So you should say, oh, 4 miles. And you can even give a bigger gasp on this. We have certain birds that are moving as much as 24 miles. Capture them today, lucky enough that a student finds that bird 24 miles away the next day, and 2 days later it's back where it was caught. So these birds are incredibly mobile. They are aware of their landscape. These shrubland birds have evolved to take advantage of shrubby areas that become available through natural disturbances. And again, what we find, this is some, kind of the poster children for the shrubland birds. Most of these shrubland birds are very uncommon in openings less than 2 acres in size. And when we're making, if we're going to make a new shrubland for these birds, meaning that we're going to decide to clear a forest to make it shrubby, usually my recommendations are make that opening about 10 acres or more if you can, primarily because this is a big enough area for that bird to see it as it's moving across the landscape. And these birds like to settle in openings where there's a lot of individuals there. So they're very social. And so a big opening is big enough to support a population. Not all of the shrubland birds are so specific to big openings though. And so if you don't have a property where you can make a 10-acre opening, sometimes some of these birds like common yellowthroats or mourning warblers or chestnut-sided warblers will come into shrubby openings that are a couple times the size of this room. And so some of these birds will utilize small areas. And we think that these birds probably evolved as what we call gap specialists, meaning that when one of those big old growth trees fell down and made a gap in the forest and it got shrubby, these birds are adapted to be able to take advantage of those small little openings as they occurred. So again, I've been focusing primarily on those shrubland-dependent birds that require shrublands for nesting, but what we're learning more and more that many of the birds that actually require mature forest for nesting actually also use shrubby areas during the breeding season. I've got a few graduate students that have been studying how forest birds like wood thrushes and ovenbirds and beautiful scarlet tanagers that nest in the forest during the breeding season, they will come into shrublands to forage on fruits and abundant insects. And then when they're young fledged, this is a common yellowthroat with some leg bands on it so we can track him into the future. This little guy, that's kind of like the chicken tender of the New Hampshire world. You know, everybody will gobble that thing up. So as these birds are developing, you know, this is a 8-day-old bird. So at 8 days, most of our songbirds are leaving the nest. So if you find a young bird that's like on your lawn, leave it alone. It left the nest for a reason. It doesn't want to go back there. The nest is a dangerous place. These birds have evolved that, okay, as soon as I'm big enough to grow feathers and I can kind of run away, I'm out of here. And they go to these shrubby areas to avoid predators. So having some shrublands adjacent to mature forest is a very valuable thing for these critters. So again, there's a lot of species that really require those shrublands, but those shrublands are beneficial to a wide variety of other species that also are using fields and wetlands and mature forest. So as an area gets shrubby, if it's in a wooded situation, we would expect it to be great browse for deer and moose and snowshoe hare. Many predators like gray fox, red fox, barred owls, broadwing hawks, short-tailed weasels, long-tailed weasels, many of our snakes like garter snakes and smooth green snakes will come into those areas because they support an abundance of birds, which also have eggs, which also have chicks, which are great food sources. There's a ton of insects and small mammals in those areas as well. Bears will come into those areas to forage on small mammals, to eat ant larvae, to feed on blueberries. Bats spend a lot of their day roosting either in the trees, in the leaves of the trees, or in cavities or under the bark. And at night they'll come out and forage over openings that have a variety of shrubby cover that support a lot of insects. And of course snowshoe hare here as well. So one of the most important tools that we have as foresters and wildlife biologists and stewards here in New Hampshire to manage our forested landscape is commercial timber harvesting. And so by commercial I mean that we are, ideally we are working with licensed forestry professionals and skilled logging operators that are following a written management plan to accomplish certain objectives on a property to make habitat, and the trees that are cut are then sold to mills for wood, for paper, for energy, and then that money is available to the landowner. And that timber harvesting is a very important tool that allows us to kind of manipulate sunlight. Again, when the trees grow up and they get they throw a lot of shade on the ground, we kind of lack some of that overstory, and we might make some decisions to manipulate that light. And then once we create a shrubland, as Steve has explained, it only stays in a shrubby condition for a short period of time. And so once we create it, we often use big tools like a brontosaurus. Here's a brontosaurus, the new and improved version. This is actually a brown brontosaurus that was developed over in Ware, New Hampshire. So this is an excavator, but instead of a bucket on the end, there's a big rotary mower. And this was designed to grind trees. So designed to maintain power line rights of way and road edges. And we use this as a very valuable tool for kind of keeping areas shrubby. Because again, so here's a power line right away, transmission line right away, that kind of shows how quickly these areas regenerate. So right after a right-of-way has been mowed, it only stays in this condition for a very short period of time. Within a single growing season, most of that vegetation is up to my waist, or in some cases taller than me if it's aspen. But here's those same basic rights-of-way, you know, just 3 growing seasons later. Very, very quick growth. And so what we find is that as a shrubland goes from kind of this flat stage to this really structurally complex stage, there's a predictable change in the bird community in particular. We find, and I apologize that you can't see these, but basically, on the bottom of each of these graphs is years since disturbance, or years since a clear cut, from 0, 5, 10, 15, and 20, and that's the same for all of these birds. And then this axis is just relative abundance, from 0 to lots of them. And so we have certain groups of birds like Carolina wrens and dark-eyed juncos and song sparrows, white-throated sparrows, indigo buntings, and Wilson snipe that tend to come into cuts immediately after they are made. These are birds that do a lot of their foraging on the ground. They nest in kind of grassy raspberry areas, which are very typical right after an opening has been made. But as the trees start to grow up, they get taller and taller, and they get shadier, and the shrubs really start to develop. Those bird species tend to decline in abundance, and they are replaced by another group of species that tend to reach their peak abundance around 10 to 15 years after that disturbance. So Nashville warblers, Canada warblers, which tend to occur in kind of softwoody wetlands, chestnut-sideds, common yellowthroats, eastern towies, and of course ruby-throated hummingbirds. And these are species that forage or nest kind of in that shrub layer. So they're keying in on different things that become available as that young forest matures. And what we find is that usually right around 10 to 15 years after a disturbance, the real shrubbiness of an opening tends to disappear. It's no longer shrubby, primarily because the trees start to grow up. And as those trees grow up, they get taller and they have bigger crowns, and they start to occupy all of that growing space, and they intercept all of the sunlight that's coming in. And so what we find is that these areas become less and less shrubby. You lose the grasses, you lose the raspberries, and it becomes a different habitat. And so as a result, usually we need to make new openings or come back and retreat an existing opening about every 10 to 15 years if we want to try to keep that shrubby condition on the landscape. And so as a general rule, we can kind of go anywhere and whack a bunch of trees down and turn trees into shrubs. However, we need to do it in a manner with far more foresight. Primarily because if we want to benefit certain species like cottontails, the cottontails only occur in certain shrubby areas, kind of those wetter sites. Woodcock in wetter sites. Prairie warblers require really dry shrublands. So if we're making openings in wet areas, it's not going to benefit prairie warblers. Similarly, there's many wildlife species that require that mature forest. All right, so if we are cutting that mature forest down, there's trade-offs. And so there's a lot of challenges that we have in maintaining shrubland habitat in our landscape today. Primarily is because our landscape is kind of messed up. We've decided to punch houses kind of all over the place. And for a lot of folks, you don't own enough property to make a 10-acre clear cut. So again, if I'm working with a landowner that has 1 acre, I can make some shrubby habitat for you, but unless you're working with your neighbors, you're not ever going to be able to attract many of these kind of shrubby species. The other thing that we deal with is that, again, mature forest is kind of fragmented now. So we do have mature forest, but it occurs in these smaller blocks. And many of the birds in particular that require those mature forests are also declining on our landscape because the forest is becoming smaller and smaller in its size. So again, there are trade-offs. If we cut the forest down to benefit the shrubland birds, that's great, but we might be losing forest birds on the landscape. It's a challenge. So how do we go about it? Kind of some practical approaches. So one of the first things is encourage folks to do what you're doing today. You know, become educated about these sorts of things. I know there's a lot of folks in the room that are very immersed in this stuff, and it's kind of not new news, but it's awesome to be in a room with 100 people and I don't recognize the vast majority of folks. And so I'm assuming that for many of you, this may be the first time you're hearing this sort of thing. So I encourage you to pick up some of our brochures that kind of have, again, awesome pictures. They kind of provide a really good overview of important habitats that we're concerned about from a conservation standpoint, and learn more about them. And you can, if you just Google search habitat stewardship brochures in UNH, you'll find those. Also, we want to identify where shrublands occur on our landscape, because many of these do support shrubland wildlife populations. And it's important for me to point out that many of the best areas for these critters are areas that we often look at as waste places. Transmission line rights of way, gravel pits. These are the habitats that support many of our species. And so identifying where those shrublands occur and then working with the surrounding landscape to benefit the overall wildlife diversity, largely by trying to make that forage more multi-age, to kind of break it up a little bit, allow some of it to grow old, but also come in and make some smaller openings to allow it to get that kind of structure that it would have naturally. And so here, this is kind of a real basic approach about how we kind of make decisions about how big an opening needs to be. And we can, at the very small end, we might cut trees as just one tree or a group of 3 trees. Then we might do some group selection where we're making openings the size of this room, or maybe 2 acres or more in size. We do other things where we kind of leave a lot of scattered trees but widely spaced, and so we have an overstory but we're letting in plenty of sunlight to allow that shrubland to grow up underneath it. Or we can use clear cutting as a very valuable tool where all of the trees are removed from a big area specifically to create that shrubby habitat. And so in a lot of our landscape today, because it's developed and because a lot of the land is fragmented, making big, huge clear cuts just doesn't make a lot of sense. However, we can do timber harvesting, kind of using that, removing trees as 1 or 2 to 3 trees up to groups less than 2 acres in size, to kind of diversify the structure that's in there. So we're retaining mature forest conditions and kind of adding some shrubby conditions in there as well, so we can kind of benefit the whole suite of species. And ideally, if we're making the small shrublands, the way that we can make them the best for those shrubby wildlife is to locate those small openings adjacent to existing shrubland habitats. So if we have alder thickets or wetland swales, we might locate them there. If we have beaver ponds, this is actually an aerial photo of the Deering Audubon Wildlife Sanctuary. That's here's some beaver wetlands in here, and this is a forested area that we've recently put in some small clear cuts, again for the purpose of creating bird habitat, wildlife habitat. Transmission line rights of way are a great spot to locate these openings as well if you have them on your property, by making a few openings periodically along the edges to kind of expand their size. Now for certain species, if we're managing, so for example, New England cottontails, it's really important that if we're making new shrublands for cottontails, we need to make those in areas, near areas where cottontails already exist. And so Tom Brightman, who's here today, works as one of our cottontail biologists in the state, and we work with private landowners and communities throughout southeastern New Hampshire looking for opportunities to create really good quality habitat for New England cottontails. This is a recent clear cut that's on the Londonderry Town Forest, about 25 acres, made specifically for cottontails. And so when we're making those new openings, we need them to be large, and so we need them to be on a pretty big property. Again, if we're making small openings, we need to have them be closer to other large ones so the cottontails can readily move. and lots of opportunities to work with professionals to do that. And so again, what we try to do this is the same opening here, just scaled out. And so in blue are a variety of clear cuts that have been made specifically for cottontails, but they just haven't been put willy-nilly on the landscape. They've been located very strategically in areas. These areas that are outlined in yellow are transmission line rights-of-way, shrubby areas. So again, we're making big openings that cottontails can reproduce in, and when they do decide that they're going to move, they can hop, and they do. We know this from genetic work that we do, as well as radio transmitters on these rabbits. They use these shrubby transmission line rights-of-way to move across the landscape to get to clear cut, to get to shrubby beaver wetlands. And there's a gravel pit right there with tons of shrubland birds in it. With regards to our shrubland birds, again, they don't necessarily need to have the shrublands right next to one another, but I've got a couple graduate students that are just finishing up now, and the work that they've done in southeastern New Hampshire shows or suggests pretty strongly that our shrubland birds prefer landscapes where multiple shrublands are clustered in close proximity to one another. And there's a lot of reasons for this. One is that these birds are really promiscuous. They pair with they pair bond for a breeding season, but the male goes around and breeds with his neighbors, and when he's doing that, the female's breeding with her neighbors. And so that happens within a shrubland, but we also know that that happens among shrublands. So when I first started doing this work, we'd band birds and we'd go out and look for them, and I'd know, boy, that green-banded prairie warbler should be right here, but he's not here today. Like, where the heck is he? He's hiding. But more, as we've learned more, well, he's next door doing whatever he does. And so having multiple shrublands in close proximity allows those birds to have access to a huge variety and number of mates, which increases their fitness, their ability to produce good offspring. Also, in some cases, if a bird loses its early nest to, say, a predator, sometimes they'll abandon that shrubland altogether and go to another one. And so if there's one immediately nearby, that's incredibly valuable. We've also found that having multiple shrublands nearby can reduce how large a shrubland needs to be to support these birds. And so oftentimes prairie warblers, which in a kind of a very dominated forested landscape might not occur in a shrubland less than 5 acres in size, if there's big shrublands in the neighborhood, they often will occur in smaller openings. So again, if you know that you've got big clear cuts or big gravel pits, within about a half a mile away, and you want to make some small shrubby openings, there's a good chance that some of these birds might actually come and use it. So this is research that just got published from one of my master's students, looking at how the landscape composition around a shrubland influences what shrublands these birds occur in. And so this is showing how birds are responding to the proportion of shrubland, other shrublands nearby, the proportions of field and pasture in orange, or development in the surrounding landscape. And what we found is that all of our birds, alder flycatchers, brown thrashers, blue-winged warblers, chestnut-sided warblers, eastern towhees, field sparrows, indigo buntings, and prairie warblers, all shrubland-dependent birds. All of these species responded positively to increasing amount of shrublands in the landscape. So again, it's showing they like to have areas where there's other shrublands nearby. The vast majority of these birds responded negatively to increasing field and pasture in the landscape, with few exceptions. Blue-winged warblers are the primary exception, primarily because we found that their preferred habitats were shrubby old fields. So having additional fields in the landscape was okay for them. The vast majority of our birds also responded negatively to increasing amounts of development. So that helps us plan, if we're making new shrublands, where should they be? They should be in landscapes that have other shrublands nearby and not a lot of fields and not a lot of development. And there'll be a test on this figure by the end of the night. So real complicated. Please don't try to read any of what's on the graph, but this is showing we looked at how was there a difference in where birds occurred in our in those human-created shrublands, in regenerating clear cuts in blue, in old fields in orange, sand and gravel pits in gray, and rights-of-way in yellow. And what we found is that there's a lot of overlap, but really what we found is that rights-of-way and gravel pits, by and large, were the shrublands that supported the vast majority of our bird species. So in southeastern New Hampshire, if I want to find a shrubland bird, I'm going to a transmission line right away, or I'm going to a gravel pit, because I can almost guarantee I will find them there. But certain birds don't occur in all shrubland types. And so what we find is that having some of all of these on the landscape are important. Because there are each of the bird species, and again, I apologize for focusing on birds because that's kind of what I'm ingrained to do. Really, all wildlife species have their own requirements for, again, do I like it dense? Do I like it tall? Do I like it short? Do I like it grassy? So those species-specific requirements for certain things means that landscapes that have a variety of different shrubland types, I'm not used to having a microphone right there, landscapes that have a variety of shrubland types on them, including the human-created ones as well as the natural ones where they do occur. Again, pine oak barrens incredibly rare on our landscape today, but where they occur, they're very, very important. Similarly, beaver wetlands are pretty common and they are used by a variety of species. So landscapes that have a variety of these different shrubland types in relatively close proximity should be expected to support the greatest variety of these wildlife. So in summary, what we found for our shrubland birds is that in southeastern New Hampshire, they were most likely to occur in big shrublands, 30 acres. They don't need them that big, but that's where they're most likely to occur. They're also more likely to occur in shrublands when about a half a mile of the surrounding landscape was a greater proportion of other shrublands rather than of fields and development. And again, what we found is that it's the transmission line rights-of-way and the gravel pits that, largely because they're large, in the case of the rights-of-way, because they're long and linear, they go across a variety of soil conditions. And so here it's really dry, but I could go, just 100 yards over and it could be a wetland. And so along the length of that right-of-way, it's incredibly diverse. And so as a result, it supports a variety of wildlife species and birds in particular. And what we're finding, again, this is work that I just got today from one of my honors students. We misnetted 24 clear cuts and 24 rights away and 12 clear cuts the past couple of years to just kind of figure out what are all of the birds, trying to figure out what's the entire community of birds that are using these openings. And what we found is that when shrublands occur in a landscape that's dominated by mature forest, that's the type of scenario that supports the greatest variety of birds. So it pulls in not only the shrubland birds, but when there's a lot of forest in that, sorry, I'm used to talking in meters, so about like a quarter of a mile, a little less, those shrublands will also have a huge variety of the mature forest birds that come into them. So clear cuts in a landscape with a lot of forest is probably the most valuable scenario that we could have for the full variety of birds on our landscape. Shrubland birds and mature forest birds. All right, so what can you do? So encourage folks to keep your eyes open as you're driving around now. Look at that transmission line right away a little differently. Look at that gravel pit a little differently. Boy, there's a skidder over there that's cutting trees down. All right, let's think about, well, what's the purpose of that? There may be, that work may be being done specifically to benefit wildlife. And so look to, identify where some of these major shrublands already occur in your landscape. So again, transmission line rights of way, clear cuts, gravel pits. And again, you don't have to do this alone. You have a variety of professionals available to help you for free if this is something that you're interested in doing kind of as an inventory for your town. And then if you know or if you yourself own a large property and you have the ability to make some big openings, we might take a look at that to see if it makes sense to make large openings on your property. And again, we would ideally do that through timber harvesting, working with licensed foresters and skilled loggers in order to create that habitat. And again, just because you want to make it doesn't mean that I'm going to recommend that you do make it. Because again, it's really important that we assess the larger landscape, because there's always a trade-off. We can make the habitat better for when we make the habitat better for this group of species, we make it less better for this group of species. And it's important to kind of look at the surrounding landscapes to make some decisions about what is lacking, what is needed, what happens when we convert that mature forest into shrublands. It doesn't make sense everywhere, but where we can, we like to. And so if you don't have the ability to make big shrublands, we can make some smaller ones, really of any size. Small patches of wildflowers, the size of that table even, can pull in insect species that wouldn't otherwise be in your property. So you don't have to have huge acreages to make benefits to wildlife. So if you're making smaller openings, we encourage folks to kind of locate them in scenarios that are adjacent or as close as possible to some of those existing bigger shrublands. It's these bigger shrublands that are going to pull the birds in particular, and if they're in the neighborhood, they can come to your property to benefit by what you do. Again, transmission line rights of way. If you cut your own firewood, these are great spots. We might make an opening there first year. 4 years later, we make another opening there. 5 years later, there. And then when that growth is 15 to 20 years old, we can start over again. And so again, you can cut all your firewood out of an area and make a little opening and basically expand the size of that transmission line right away to benefit wildlife. If you have only one opening, so maybe you have an opening the size of this room or a couple acres in size, and that's the one that you want to keep shrubby, there's a lot of different ways that you can go about doing that. But typically what my recommendation is you don't mow the whole thing down. So once you get shrubs established, especially if they're native shrubs, there's no reason to go and mow them down, because those shrubs are only going to get so high. What we're concerned about is the sapling trees, particularly the sapling hardwoods, which eventually can get tall enough to start shading those shrubs out. And so one recommendation that we might make would be, again, if you have a big opening, we might, you can work with a professional to get a big piece of equipment to do it, or again, if you have a brush saw, which is like a weed whacker with a big blade on it, or a chainsaw, I encourage folks to, I usually say, hey, 1 weekend a year, go in and just cut all of the tallest saplings out and you're done. And so again, that creates a situation that maintains that area in a shrubby condition, keeps it very diverse, and can provide the benefit for a variety of species. If you have invasive plants in there, you can go and cut those out. But again, I encourage folks to not pull the invasive plants, and I'd be happy to chat about that. And again, there's a lot of professionals that are available to provide you with assistance. Myself and Steve and our colleagues at Cooperative Extension, our colleagues at New Hampshire Fish and Game, at the USDA Natural Resources Association Conservation Service, and folks from the Wildlife Management Institute. Your call gets us out of the office, so please write that down. And there are a variety of financial assistance programs available to help you pay for this work if there is a cost to you. And with that, I'd be happy to try to answer any. I guess we're going to gather up front for questions, and just want to thank some of the sponsors that we have for the research that we're up to. And again, appreciate your time.